My pleasure to introduce author Linda Sittig tonight. Linda is a writer based near Chapel Hill, North Carolina. She was an educator of merit for 36 years in both public schools and Shenandoah University. She has written 5 published books and has a really interesting blog called Stories of Strong Women that I highly suggest you look at. Her most recent book is Opening Closed Doors, which she's going to talk about tonight. Thank you for being here tonight, Linda.
Thanks, Jeremy. And I'm delighted to be here to share with everybody the story behind the story of Opening Closed Doors. And as Jeremy said, I am a published author. I have 5 books that are out, 3 of which are historical fiction, showcasing strong female protagonists. And then I have a creative nonfiction, a military book, actually, and then Opening Closed Doors, which is for children. So to start you on my journey, you're going to have to go back with me to February of 2011. Now, my husband and I had lived in Western Loudoun County for many, many years, and we were living in Percival at the time, and I was walking through the back streets of Percival, and I was walking along G Street, which was the old color line a long time ago in Percival. And as I walked along G Street, I came up to the intersection of G Street and 11th Street, and I saw off to the left what would be a curb was just lined with bouquet of flowers, fresh flowers, beautiful bouquets all along the curb. There was no house, it was just an empty lot, and I couldn't figure out what the flowers were for. There was no signs or anything. And just about that time, an older African-American gentleman also walked over and was looking at the flowers, and I said to him, "Do you know who the flowers are for?" And he turned to me and said, "Oh, yes, they're for Josie Murray. This was her house." And I said, "Oh, okay. I don't know who Josie Murray was or is." And he said, "Well, she was just about the best seamstress that ever lived in Loudoun County." And he said, "Her home used to be here and her shop." And he said, "But they tore it down. They're building a new house." And he said, "The flowers are all here in a testimony to Josie." I said, "Oh, okay, interesting." And then about 2 weeks later, I was having coffee with a friend who had lived her whole life, had grown up in Percival. And I mentioned to her that I had seen all these flowers on 11th Street. And I said, I understand it's where the house Josie Murray used to live in. And my friend nodded, and I said, I hear she was one of the best seamstresses ever in Loudoun County. And the friend nodded again and looked at me, and she said, "But Linda, you do know that she is the one who is responsible for forcing the desegregation of the Percival Library." And my eyes opened and I said, "No. In fact, I've lived here a long time. I didn't even realize that the library at one time was for whites only." And she said, "Oh, yeah." And she said it was because of Josie and her husband Sam that it finally became desegregated. So then I started thinking about, wow, this would be a great topic for the blog that I write. My blog, which is now in its 14th year, I write every month about a strong woman in history. It's called strongwomeninhistory.com. And I profile one woman each month who a lot of people haven't heard of, but who did something pretty extraordinary and should receive accolades for it. So I originally was thinking, well, I'll write about Josie Murray for my blog. And I decided that what I would have to do is start doing some research. Luckily, just a few months later, the Percival Library was celebrating the 60th anniversary of the desegregation of the library, and they were doing a full-day program that was called Cross the Line. Excuse me. So I went to the full-day program and I ran into Harold Jackson. Now, Harold and I had talked together at Cool Spring in Leesburg many years ago, and Harold still lived in Percival on G Street. And I was talking to him at the Across the Line celebration, and I said, "Harold, I really would like to write a book about Josie. I'd really like to write a book about Josie Murray." And he looked at me and he said, "Well, you're going to need help." He said, there's a bunch of people you're going to need to talk about. And I said, "Well, all right, give me the names of those people." He said, "Well, you're going to want to talk to Sheila Kelly and Reggie Sims and Linda Jackson King and Doreen Hope and Deborah Lee." He said, "Because they all knew Josie." And I said, "Well, did you know Josie?" And he said, "Oh, yes." He said, "We all knew Josie." So I decided this is what I was going to do. And one by one, I started calling people that had grown up and had known Josie and asked if I could interview them. so I could find out more about her, because I really wanted to write a book on her. And then I was lucky enough that Linda Jackson King, who's Josie's niece, sort of took me under wing and said, I will share with you everything that I know about my aunt. And Linda and I became good friends, and I would go over to her house, which is one of the last homes that Josie had lived in, and she would show me a lot of different things that had belonged to Josie. So the story, little by little, started unfolding, and I started doing the research. And I knew I wanted to make it a children's book because I wanted children to understand the importance of history. I'm a history major myself from college. And I wanted them to see that even just one person can make a difference and really change history. And in this case, it was going to be Josie Murray and her husband, Sam. So I started drafting the book, and I thought, okay, well, what would surprise children about learning about segregation? Young children, 3rd, 4th, 5th grade. And I started thinking about, all right, segregation would have meant separate restaurants, separate schools, separate a library that was whites only, restrooms maybe that were segregated. And I started thinking about it, and I thought something children could identify with was not being allowed to go get an ice cream cone in a restaurant in Purcellville. So that's how I started the book. And you can see by the cover of it, Opening Closed Doors, Josie's there with her grandmother, Lena Mama, and looking at the front door of a restaurant in Purcellville where she's not allowed to go in because she's a child of color, and is saying to her grandmother, but why can't I go in? And her grandmother is saying, because rules are rules and it's whites only. And Josie says, even as an 8-year-old child, but the rules aren't fair. So that's how the book started out. What I'm going to do is I'm going to story walk the book for you. I'm not going to go page by page, but I'm going to give you the story and show you why I was so passionate to make it into a children's book. So it starts with Josie, about 8 years old, wanting to get an ice cream, and her grandmother, Lena Mama, says to her, we have to go to the takeout window. Now, if you've ever lived in Purcellville, the restaurant that is featured in the book would have been the White Palace. And at the back of the White Palace, in an alley, was a takeout window. And if you were a person of color, you could go to the takeout window behind the restaurant and you could order takeout food, or you could order an ice cream cone. So that's how I started the story. The story then progresses with Josie going from being 8 years old to being 13 years old, and she is finished with school. She's gone to a segregated school in Purcellville. It was built behind where Lyle's funeral home is today. And at once she had finished 7th grade, that was it. It was another closed door. There was no high school for the children, for the colored children that were in Purcellville at that time. We're talking this would have been like in the 1930s. There was a high school, but it was in Lincoln, and it was whites only. And so Josie decides that she's been making little clothes for her dolls, and she's going to ask her grandmother and her mother to teach her to make real dresses. And so she starts learning everything about sewing. By the age of 20, she marries Sam Murray, who is an upholsterer from Hamilton, Virginia. They buy the lot right across the street from Josie's parents on 11th Street. And they actually move a building onto the lot next to the house, and they open it up as their business, and they call it the shop. And while Sam did upholstery, Josie did seamstressing, making, refashioning clothes, doing drapes, just about anything you would want her to do. And she became very, very good. She had clients that were both black and white. She had people coming out from as far as Washington, D.C. to ask her to do commissions. And she became very, very well known for how particular and meticulous that she was as a seamstress. So let's go up to December 1956. And Josie's in the shop, called the shop, and a new client comes in to the shop and tells Josie that she's new. She and her husband are military, and they live in Washington, D.C. She introduces herself as Mrs. Mabel Moore, and they bought a weekend home in Hillsborough. And Mrs. Moore would like to have special drapes put in this house, and she wants Josie to make them. And the drapes would be called Austrian shades. Now, Josie's never made Austrian shades before, but she doesn't see that as a problem. She's willing to learn how to do it. And then Mrs. Moore says, the pattern is in your local library. And Josie knows that the Percival Library is whites only, but she still agrees to take the case. She goes home, she talks it over a little bit with Sam, and Sam's saying to her, Josie, don't be barring trouble. That's a whites only library, you know that. And Josie says, I know that, but I still want to get the book with the pattern and make the drapes for Mrs. Moore. So they wait till after Christmas. They dress up in their church clothes and they drive uptown and they go up to the Percival Library. Now, the Percival Library back in the 50s is not the Percival Library that we know today. Today, you go in, there's a big parking lot. You go in at a lower level where the children's library is. Back in the 50s, you went to the library right off Main Street. There was a walkway that went up to the stone facade of the building, and you went in through that small door, and that led you into the only part of the library that existed at that time, which is the second floor today. And Josie and Sam, holding their breath, I guess, for a moment, they open the door and they walk inside. And they are the first people of color that have ever stepped inside the Percival Library. And right away, the librarian at the circulation desk looks up and says, you can't be in here. And Josie says, I just came in to pick out a book. And the woman says, no, we don't let colored people in here. You have to leave. And in my mind, I think Josie just got very obstinate and she just stood there. And then the librarian turned to Sam and said, you go call Mr. Emmerich. You go call him and you tell him what Josie's trying to do. So Oscar Emmerich was the head of the Percival Library Board. Sam dug, I guess, a dime out of his pocket, went over to the wall phone in the library, and he called Oscar Emmerich. And Mr. Emmerich said, well, tell Josie to sit tight. I'll come over and I'll check the book out for her. And I think at this point, something just snapped in Josie. She had had closed doors her entire life. And she said, if I can't get the book myself, I don't want it. And she walked out of the library. Sam followed her. So they got back home and they realized now what they had to do is call Mrs. Moore and explain that Josie couldn't take the commission, and so she would have to back out of the project. And Mrs. Moore said, well, why? And Josie said, well, I'm not allowed, I couldn't get the book out of the library. And Mrs. Moore said, why? And Josie said, because I'm a Negro and they would not allow me in. And Mrs. Moore says, oh, I'm terribly sorry. I didn't realize. I'm new to the area. And just sit tight and just wait till tomorrow. Don't do anything. Wait till tomorrow. So Josie says, okay, and hangs up. So the next day, Mrs. Moore calls back and says to Josie, I called my brother-in-law last night and we talked this whole thing over. And we both think that you and Sam have every right to check a book out of that library. And in fact, we think you should go get a lawyer. And Josie says, well, it's very nice, but the library is not going to change. And anyway, who is your brother-in-law? And Mrs. Moore says, Dwight D. Eisenhower, President of the United States of America. Now, can you imagine the shock that Sam and Josie had when they realized that Mrs. Moore is the sister-in-law to the President of the United States? And Josie says, okay. And Mrs. Moore says, we're going to work with you. So we're going to help you find a lawyer. Well, there was no lawyer in Virginia who would take the case to help Josie and Sam. And Mrs. Moore, and I guess Dwight Eisenhower, found Oliver E. Stone in Washington, D.C. He was a Quaker lawyer, and he took the case on pro bono. And he told Josie and Sam that he was going to go ahead and he would take their case and they would force the library to desegregate, basically. It blew Percival apart from everything I researched and read. It divided the town in half. Half the people wanted the library to stay whites only. Half of the people felt it was time for integration and the library should be open to everybody. And then there was a small segment of Percival who said, I'd rather see the library closed than let it open to colored people. So it became a real bone of contention in the town about the fact that Sam and Josie Murray were threatening to sue the library. A lot of harassment started. Josie and Sam would get phone calls constantly, and when they would answer the phone, there'd be nobody there. Also, at one night, there was a large convoy, I'll say, of cars and pickup trucks that came down G Street and then pulled up on 11th Street and then shined their headlights right into the front window of Sam and Josie's house. And they were petrified. They were frightened because they didn't know what was going to happen. Remember, this is the 1950s. Jim Crow laws are existing. Segregation is existing. Nobody got out of the cars and never did anything, but it was very unsettling to both Josie and Sam. The library board met and voted on should the library board integrate, and it was a stalemate. It was a 50% yes, 50% no, so nothing happened. And the months and the weeks started trickling by. Finally, Oliver Stone decided he would do a newspaper campaign, and he took out articles in newspapers from Boston to DC with headlines saying, Negroes have been refused admittance at Loudoun County public libraries. And then Oliver Stone, doing his research, found out that the Purcellville Library had actually accepted federal funds from the United States government when they were doing some repairs on the library. Well, once you accept federal funding, your building is public. And that means if it's a public building, it's open to everyone. And so now the library board was facing the idea that if they did not integrate, they could lose that funding that the federal government had given them. They reconvened again, and on April 8th, 2 of the library board members switched their votes, and in a vote 7-5, they voted to integrate the library. And so April 8th, 1957, the Purcellville Library becomes integrated. And Josie is one of the first people to go into the library, and she is able to check out the book on getting the patterns, and she makes the drapes for Mrs. Moore. A few months later, or a few weeks actually later, the phone rings again at Josie and Sam's house, and when they answer the phone this time, it's actually President Eisenhower, and he wants Josie to come to the White House and do some sewing for his wife, for Mamie. And Josie packs up her portable Singer sewing machine and goes to the White House and actually makes some drapes for the White House. She also makes drapes for the Gettysburg farm, the Eisenhower farm, their summer farm, and makes drapes for some of the rooms up there too. So it's a huge monumental change because of the library desegregating. Eventually, within a few years, most of Purcellville desegregates. The restaurants begin to open. Josie goes and gets an ice cream cone on her own. The schools begin to integrate. In the year 1962, when Loudoun Valley High School was just opening, the school integrated with 4 African-American students, and one of them was Linda Jackson King, my friend, who was Josie's niece. So it's really quite a testimony to the early civil rights movement that Josie and Sam Murray did what they did with courage to change something that absolutely was unfair. In the book, I end with Josie going to get the ice cream cone because it brings the book full circle. As part of my research and doing all of this, I was really lucky that so many people in Purcellville came forward to help me. And at the library at that time, the manager of the Purcellville Library was Kareem Khan. And I went and talked with him about the book. And I said, I really want to walk up the front steps and come in the library just the way Josie and Sam did that day in January of 1957. So he walked outside, met me at the library. We walked up the steps together. He said, go ahead, put your hand on the doorknob. I pulled open the door and walked in. They're offices now, but I walked into what Josie and Sam would have seen going into the library. And honestly, it gave me goosebumps. Now, the book was finally written. I felt very proud of what I had done, but then I had to figure out how I was going to get it published. And publishing, especially a children's book, is highly competitive in America. And so I sent out dozens and dozens of query letters to all sorts of agents and publishers and presses. And I finally got a verbal offer from a very prestigious publishing firm in New York City, Madison Avenue, right up there at the top of the top. They were very interested in the story. They wanted the manuscript. We talked about how long it would take for producing it, and they said it has to go through a committee. And I said, okay. And every couple of months they would email me back saying, we're still working on this idea. It'll go through committee. We'll be issuing you a contract. And they did that for 1 full year. And at the end of 1 full year, I simply got an email that said, we're sorry, but the marketing team has decided it would be better if Josie had been a character for STEM, which is science, technology, economics, and math, instead of a civil rights story. And so we are returning your manuscript to you. 1 entire year. And I had to start all over again. But I did. I thought about Josie and her courage, and so I started over again and sent queries out. And I found a publisher in Richmond, Virginia, Brandy Lane Publishing, who absolutely loved Josie's story and contacted me right away saying they'd be proud to be my publisher. And they're the ones who published it. Going through working with them was a wonderful experience, except in the very beginning when they sent me all the samples of artists that they work with, I realized that all the art samples were from white artists. And I called the editor and he said, how could you possibly know that? And I said, I've taught children's literature at Shenandoah University for 30 years. I can almost always tell when an illustrator is a Black illustrator because they draw Black people differently than white illustrators do. And he said, okay. And I said, this is a book on segregation. I'm a white author. You can't have a white author and a white illustrator. So they went back to the drawing board and they found a wonderful young illustrator, Whitney Truitt, from the Hampton Roads area, a few years out of college, and she agreed to be the illustrator. So with the help of Linda Jackson King helping me to write the story and Whitney Truitt illustrating the story, I felt there that we finally had a fair balance of perspective on Josie's story. I finally signed my contract in October of 2020. Now remember, it had been February 2011 when I had learned who Josie Murray was. So that just goes to show you that it's not that easy getting books published. It was a 9-year process for me to bring Josie's story to life. I signed the contract. That same day, I drove out to Mount Olive Baptist Cemetery, out sort of on the outskirts of Lincoln. I went to where Josie was buried, and I said out loud to the cemetery, Josie, your story is going to be read for many, many years to come. Then I had to look for people who would endorse the book. I got Deborah Taylor, who was one of the librarians from Enoch Pratt Library in Baltimore. I sent her a copy of the book. She said I'd be glad to endorse it. I contacted the Eisenhower family, and David Eisenhower said, oh, Linda, I would love to endorse the book. I remember coming to Percival when I was a little kid with my grandfather. So that was wonderful. Shenandoah University endorsed it because they wanted to use it in their curriculum of teaching teachers how to bring literacy to life in the classroom. So all in all, I felt very proud that Josie's story was going to be available for everybody. And The Opening Closed Doors, the story of Josie Murray, is now in many, many public libraries, Fairfax County, Loudoun County. It's now in North Carolina counties. I went up to Chapel Hill the other day. It was displayed in the Children's Library at Chapel Hill. So Josie's story has gone live.